welcome to our panel, whose title is Venezuelan Crisis, What's Next? Today we have a list of very distinguished guests to discuss the current situation in Venezuela. As you know, we have been discussing the situation at CEBRI for the last couple of weeks. We already hosted two webinars on the issue of the Venezuela situation, but focused mainly on the Brazilian role of the crisis. And the idea here today is to have a broader discussion of the Venezuela crisis in Latin America, and also discuss the crisis itself. And for that discussion, as I mentioned, we have this very distinguished list of guests. First, we have Ambassador Thomas Shannon, who is a U.S. ambassador to Brazil from 2010 to 2013, co-chair of the Brazil Advisory Board at the Wilson Center and senior international policy advisors at Arnold and Porter. We also have Director Marcela Rios Tobar, who is the Director for Latin American and Caribbean region at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, International IDEA, and former Minister of Justice of the Chilean government of Gabriel Boric administration. And finally, we have our distinguished guest that confirmed a couple of days ago his participation, so it's an honor to have him at the last minute. Senator José Miguel Insulza, Senator of Chile, and former Secretary General of the Organization of American States, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and former Minister of Interior of Chile as well. And on the Brazilian side, we have Mr. Hussein Kalout, who is International Advisory Board member at CEBRI, PhD International Relations at Lancaster University, and former Secretary of Strategic Affairs of Brazil. So as I mentioned, the idea here today is to have a discussion from different angles of what the situation in Venezuela. We will start with Ambassador Thomas Shannon, then we'll pass to Ms. Marcela Tobar, and then Senator Insulza and Hussein Kalout. Everyone is invited to pose your questions on the Zoom platform. I will collect these questions at the end of the presentations, and we'll have discussion after that. So again, thank you very much for everyone to being here. And Ambassador Thomas Shannon, you have the floor. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Feliciano, and it's a tremendous pleasure to be with all of you today, but especially with this very distinguished panel. It is my intention and hope to participate in a discussion that define the challenges presented by Venezuela at this particular moment, but also to begin to look for ways to address these challenges in a fashion that can promote order and stability inside Venezuela, but also strengthen democratic processes and institutions in Venezuela and throughout the region. I think it's worthwhile noting that what happened in Venezuela is not hidden. I think it is well understood, and the recent release of a UN experts report highlights that this was a stolen election. And while we might debate the parameters of that, the real issue is, how does Venezuela's constitutionally structured institutions respond to this? Can they respond to it? And can the international community help Venezuela find a way through an election process that has divided the country, polarized the country, and created an environment that is dangerous? There are a few things that have to be understood as we address this larger problem. The first is the determination of the government of Nicolas Maduro to remain in power, and its resilience in the face of significant international pressure directed by the United States and others to create a pathway for them out of power. I think we also have to recognize the determination of the opposition and the leadership of Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez in fashioning an election and an option for the Venezuelan opposition, which actually allowed the Venezuelan people to speak. And the third reality in Venezuela today is that this is more than just a dispute between the government of Nicolas Maduro and the political opposition, because there is a new and important actor involved, and that is the Venezuelan people. The Venezuelan people have not had an opportunity to express themselves through their votes in quite some time. But they did so in massive numbers and with every intention and purpose of driving political change and transition in Venezuela. That has not happened so far. But what also has not happened is that this vote shows clearly that the government of Nicolas Maduro cannot claim political legitimacy within Venezuela. And this complicates the life of those who have supported that government over time, especially countries like Russia and China and Iran, who now know without a doubt that they are working with a partner from a very weakened and a partner which can only sustain itself in power through repression. But the opposition itself also faces a challenge, which is having helped draw the Venezuelan people into this larger discussion and conversation, having created an atmosphere and an environment in which what was important was not the candidate of the opposition, but the ability of the Venezuelan people to speak. How to protect that vote, how to defend the people who went out to vote and who have been participating in street demonstrations, protesting the result as announced by the National Electoral Commission in Venezuela. But also how to make sure that as they engage with the government and engage with the international community, that they are not put in a position in which they are seen to betray the very people that voted for them. And the larger challenge facing the mediators in this dispute, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, is first of all to form a common understanding of events and a common purpose. And although within the press, the tendency is to group these three countries together, they all have very different interests in Venezuela. And they all face very distinct internal political environments that will shape how they engage with Venezuela. But I think what drives them all, but especially Brazil and Colombia, is trying to define a solution that will ensure some degree of order and stability inside of Venezuela and some degree of hope for political change that will convince Venezuelans to stay in Venezuela and not flee. Over time, we have seen up to 8 million Venezuelans leave Venezuela, migrate out, first to South American and Central American countries, and then to the United States. That was driven by, in many ways, economic necessity and the crushing impact on the Venezuelan economy of a maximum pressure campaign. But if there is another wave of migration out of Venezuela, it will not be driven by economics. It will be driven by politics. And it will be driven by a recognition that the Venezuelan people's efforts to express themselves has been completely disrespected and ignored. And that the only hope for Venezuelans is to leave. And Brazil and Colombia, being the first exit points for Venezuelans, are going to look for ways to stop that. And that means involving themselves in a larger process inside of Venezuela. In this regard, I think it's worth noting that since 1998, since the election of Hugo Chavez, and since his declaration that the Pacto de Punto Fijo, or the Punto Fijo Agreement, was dead, has effectively created in Venezuela a zero-sum approach to elections. For those of you unfamiliar with the Pacto de Punto Fijo, this was a political agreement done in the aftermath of Venezuela's return to democracy in 1958, which established the rules and the regulations by which there was alternation of power in Venezuela through elections and peaceful transfer of power, largely done by the Social Democratic and the Christian Democratic political parties. Once that political agreement was declared dead and buried, it created an environment in which democratic elections were all about occupying the state and then using that occupation of the state to pursue political agendas that were exclusive, not inclusive over time. And regrettably, we're seeing this play out now because neither side in this debate is prepared to admit defeat. The opposition, because they won, but the government, because they're afraid that should they vacate power, that they will become a target and they will not be able to maintain their control of the state, of assets and resources, and of all the business that's connected to it. And so the challenge that the mediators are going to face is how to overcome this sense of zero sum, how to overcome this sense of existential threat on both sides, and how to begin to construct a political space in which the voice of the Venezuelan people can be heard clearly and can be affirmed through the electoral institutions of Venezuela. And as you can imagine, this will not be easy. The United States has pursued over the past several years a very careful approach that was designed to reestablish some degree of communication with the Maduro government, draw it into negotiations that would lead it to elections, then to work with the opposition to ensure that the opposition understood that the elections were about the Venezuelan people and not about candidates, political parties, or the personal ambitions of people within the opposition. And the Biden administration did this very successfully. It also sought to larger U.S. geopolitical concerns from the maximum pressure sanctions that the Trump administration had placed on Venezuela. And this meant special focus on oil and gas sector and looking for ways to begin to open that sector, not only to companies already operating in Venezuela like Chevron, but also opening it to investment from partner nations who would begin to revive the oil and gas sector in Venezuela in order to promote greater stability in global energy markets. But the Biden administration also sought to have a relationship with the government of Maduro in order to manage the migration crisis, and especially to allow deportation of Venezuelans from the United States to Venezuela. These goals remain an important part of how the Biden administration approaches this issue. And it's one of the reasons why they have sought to empower and raise the profile of the three countries, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, that are taking on this mediation role. It's worth noting that in the recent OAS Permanent Council meeting, the inability of the United States and some of its partners in the region to win clear approval for a resolution calling on Venezuela to present the vote tally sheets and to show that the Maduro government had indeed won that election, highlights that, number one, the United States is not in a position to impose a solution. Number two, that the region is fractured around Venezuela, largely because of the work Venezuela has done over time through Petrocaribe and ALBA and others to build support and to provide resources to partners around the region. But it also highlighted the real doubt and concern that Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico had about allowing the OAS to be the platform from which to engage Venezuela. Whatever you think of that decision, the decision by Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico not to participate in that. Brazil and Colombia abstain in the Permanent Council. Mexico doesn't even show up. The three mediators who could have handed this off to the OAS and gone about their merry way have instead assumed responsibility for this mediation process. From my point of view, that's courageous. And it shows just how important and seriously they're taking this issue. And I believe they're acting in good faith. And I really believe that they are kind of the only hope at this point to open up the Maduro administration conversation. With this, I've got one further observation, and with this, I'll close my initial remarks and look forward to those of my colleagues on the panel and then the broader discussion. But one of the larger challenges that diplomacy faces in Venezuela is that Venezuela has been cornered and isolated broadly in the region. And we need to find a way to end that. We need to find a way to open Venezuela to larger engagement with the world that will allow the Venezuelan people to understand that there can be engagement that can further economic growth and development, but also promote democratic change and transition. Many people on this call have done this before. They have sought to find diplomatic solutions that are about creating a space in which not only can people come together to talk and try to identify common solutions, but which also recognize that in a larger world of diplomatic engagement, your only hope is to negotiate, that ultimately solutions cannot be imposed. And with that, I thank you, Feliciano, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador Thomas Shannon. Thank you for your very good remarks. Now I'd like to pass the word to Ms. Marcela Tobar. Please, Ms. Marcela Tobar, you have the floor. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much, Feliciano and Sebri, for the invitation. It's an honor to share this panel. I think it shows the preoccupation that we have throughout Latin America, in particular, and in the world of the situation in Venezuela. From the standpoint of IDEA International, the Institute for the Support of Democracy and Elections, we have been following the situation. And I first wanted to say, thinking of how we arrive at July 28th. For us, it is important to note that the deterioration of the Venezuelan democracy has been a slow and systematic process. It's not something that just occurred on one electoral process, but it has been something that we have been showing throughout the years. The state of democracy assessments that we publish every year have shown that systematic deterioration. Venezuela occupies number 147 among 174 countries around the world in the dimensions of democracy that we consider relevant for democracy. We understand that elections are the pillar for a democratic process, but we also see democracy encompassing variables regarding representation, participation, rights, and the rule of law and Estado de Derecho, as we would say in Spanish. And in the Venezuelan case, the deterioration has been in all of these 4 dimensions in the last decade or so, but it's particularly worrisome in the rule of law, and in the state and in rights. And that has important consequences to not just the crisis that we saw in this election, but also what needs to be done in the future, because we have a weakness or the complete absence of autonomous state institutions that are autonomous from the executive power. We have a weakening rule of law, a weak judicial system, as the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights and the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Human Rights have once again mentioned. The penal law is used to criminalize protests and to persecute opponents. So we have a situation in Venezuela that is not new, that is not just a product of a fraudulent election. The second thing is that, as we all know, the economic and social crisis of Venezuela has caused one of the biggest population movements in the history of the of South America, and we have approximately 8 million Venezuelans that have, migrated to different countries. One of the major differences of this major population movement from previous processes in a region is that it used to be common that Latin Americans would migrate to the United States or to Europe, but in this case, the migration has stayed in our countries, and that has caused important consequences in terms of economics, in terms of social and cultural dimension, but also in internal politics. The ambassador was saying how internal political dynamics in every country in a way shape the positions that different states are taking, and the role of the migration is also having a role and an impact in the positions that different governments are taking today with respect to Venezuela. The second thing I wanted to mention is it's about the electoral process itself. We all know here that an electoral cycle is not just the act of the day of voting. It entails registration, entails campaigns, entails a lot and a long process of preparation. We have at this moment, at least 2 of the preliminary reports of the 2 observation missions that were present. The United States did not have an observation mission. They have a technical assistance, small mission that we just found out. We just read the report yesterday, but we have been also read the report by the Carter Center. And I think both reports show that the previous process to the election, the preparation of the election process, was plagued by irregularities in the sense that it was not an equitable playing field. The opposition had immense problems in campaigning. They had difficulty registering, their candidates. There was a lot of obstacles for put on the campaign, on movement, among other problems. But both reports also acknowledge that the electoral system itself that has been developed by Venezuela has it's a strong electoral system technically, that we have a system that was capable of producing a fair and adequate result. It was difficult to tamper with the electoral process itself while it was taking place, and that a lot of technical precautions have been put in place so that local observers and everybody who was participating in the electoral process itself could have access to secure results. They have codes, they had a lot of information. They had also secured different parallel systems of transmission of the votes. So it is important to note that the National Electoral Commission in Venezuela did not just have one way of receiving the tally of the votes from around the country. It was not through internet. They had parallel systems. So the technial dimension of the election could have been, carried out or was carried out in adequate terms. The third point about the election day itself, and I think everybody has acknowledged this, and I think this is an important issue because it's in a way something that is different from previous electoral process that we had seen in Venezuela in the past. And that was not just the fact that the opposition managed to stay together and managed to have, a unified platform, but it also that the Venezuelan people, the majority of citizens, believed in these elections. trusted this process despite all the obstacles and despite all the problems. Venezuelan people thought that they could trust an institutional process as a way out of a crisis. And we have a peaceful and massive political participation. The official, let's remember that Venezuela has voluntary voting, and the official number is that a little bit over 59% of registered voters participated in the election. That is very different from the two past elections where we had formally reported participation of 46 in the 2018 election, and a little bit over 50% in the election before in 2013, only 50% of the vote. So this time we had 59% of participation, but that 59% does not include the huge Venezuelan diaspora outside the country. That it's, certain calculations estimate that around 4.5% of registered voters were outside the country, and we have no way of knowing how many of those people voted, but because of all the restrictions that they had in changing their addresses, it's highly probable that the majority of them could not vote. So the participation could have been much higher if registration process was adequate. So in terms of the election, and I think particularly both the Carter Center report, but particularly the UN report that we read yesterday, I think give us the impression that the process was going smoothly until the authorities began receiving the votes. And probably until they realized that they had lost the election by an important margin. And then, the transmission of information was stopped, and neither of the two international actors that were present in the country have a way of verifying, the final tally of the vote. We only have what the opposition has shared. So what to do next? And I wanted to concentrate on the electoral process and the day of the election, and leave the geopolitical analysis to the other axes. But I would want to say two other things before ending this first round of comments. First, we believe that any solution to this crisis must take in consideration, trying to respect and take care that such an attack on electoral integrity is not naturalized. We are facing in Latin America challenges to electoral integrity from different dimensions. The transmission of power in Brazil and in Guatemala are close examples of recent examples, but we have been in many other places. We have increasingly contestation, persecution of electoral authorities, intervention in electoral bodies, calling for fraudulent elections where there is no fraudulent elections. So we are in a situation in Latin America where electoral integrity is not secure around the continent. This is not just, a problem that we've seen in one country. And our preoccupation is that whatever we do and however we do, we find a solution to Venezuela. The solutions that we find must establish a strong precedent of protecting electoral integrity. I think that is fundamentally going forward. And even though we might all have, political and reasonable doubts about the tallies, the actas electorales being produced, I think the international community, and in particular, everyone interested in defending democracy, we need to continue asking that the authorities in Venezuela show the results and are open to some sort of international or impartial scrutiny of what a very strong electoral system should have somewhere. So we do need to continue that route, not just for Venezuela, but for the health of electoral integrity around the continent. And the last thing I wanted to say is about migration. I know it's not necessarily the fundamental issue right now, but facing with the possibility of a new wave of migration, we also want to make the point that we see with preoccupation that many of the countries and the political actors in the region that are espousing and promoting the defense of democracy and the defense of electoral integrity are not necessarily showing the same commitment to the international norms in terms of human rights, in terms of what the situation of migrants. The majority of countries are closing borders, are installing new securities to impede the influx of Venezuelans. A lot of our countries in the region have Venezuelans that have irregular situations. Those are people that cannot return.
Yeah, thank you. You're muted again, Ms. Tobar. You're muted again.
Sorry, those Venezuelans that cannot leave their country or that have irregular situations in other countries should also be a concern to the international community, and we also make a call for the solution to the Venezuelan crisis to have a multilateral and international preoccupation for the situation of Venezuelans across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tobar, for your very good presentation, especially on the issue of the importance of the electoral integrity in Latin America. We saw that in Brazil in our last election. Just a piece of information. In our last panel, we had a Brazilian who participated in the Carter mission in Venezuela, and he gave us this piece of information that among the millions of Venezuelans who were abroad, only 508 people, not 500,000, but 508 people were allowed to vote from abroad in the electoral process. So that was a striking number of how difficult it were for the people from Venezuela as abroad to be able to vote in the election. So thank you very much for your very good presentation. Now I'd like to pass the floor to Ms. Hussein Insulza. Thank you again for being here with us. Welcome. You're muted. Yeah. You're muted.
Thank you for this opportunity, and great to be here again with Sebri, and special pleasure of seeing again from Shannon, who was so important in Latin America and U.S. foreign relations in the first part of the century. I think that his role in leading the policies of the United States for Latin America created a very good situation at that time that hopefully will remain. So I'm very happy to be here with him. Well, it's only been about 2 weeks since the election took place, and I don't think there's anybody remaining. There's nobody remaining in the world that can really state or defend the notion that Nicolás Maduro got more votes than Edmundo González in the election in Venezuela. And the reason for this is very simple. I mean, Maduro, his government and his party have in their hands, as they have recognized, all the proceedings of the elections, all the tallies of the election, and they have simply refused to make them of public knowledge. As they should, they had to do it according to the law, and it was natural that they will do it if they had good results. But after at a certain point, as Marcela was pointing out, they realized that they were losing the election by a very high percentage of votes. The United Nations report speaks about 4 million voters, 4 million difference. which if you add all the people in the abroad that could not vote would make about 8 million Venezuelans rejecting Maduro higher than those who were accepting him. So actually, I think that was what really shook things out. Let me just say this. I mean, it's interesting that in 2007, Hugo Chavez had a referendum for permanent to make a to keep power for the indefinite time, and he lost it. He lost it by a short margin, but they were willing to recognize the results about when there are still about 20% votes to be counted, and probably they were losing by more. But everybody accepted that that as long as he was willing to accept defeat, nobody was willing to rub it on him. This time it will be different, because actually Maduro was losing by such a high vote that was clearly as stable as, I mean, throw him out of the country as soon as the result was known. Now, so after they delivered the first percentage unilaterally without figures by the electoral commission on the minute of the election, and they started with this all completely crazy excuses, like the hacking of the site of the National Electoral Council. Then they promised to present all the results. Remember Maduro saying, my party has all the results, I'm going to present them to the whole world. That never happened. And then they start these speeches of Maduro on television, quoting the Bible, those who about those who believe without seeing, and hoping that people will believe without seeing. But it's not all they were getting. So actually, it's not strange that even the countries that supported originally Maduro in his fraud have kept quiet on the matter. I haven't seen on any clip, any press clips from Nicaragua, from Cuba or other saying speaking about how good the elections were for Maduro. Nobody's speaking about that because everybody knows that doing so would enhance their own credibility, would create a problem in their own credibility. And of course, because an election that should have been competitive was a landslide. That's the whole point. It was a landslide, which they are never. I don't think that they are never going to recognize. My opinion is that that's not going to happen, in spite of Lula's was there a few days ago that they were to wait while their patience lasts for results to be delivered, but the results are not going to be delivered because Maduro cannot do that. Now, I think it's important to remember here that this election was made possible by a negotiation. By a negotiation, first with the Barbados Agreement on the 17th of October 23 between Maduro and the Plataforma Unitaria of parties in Venezuela. And that had the participation of some diplomatic representatives from Norway, from Barbados, from the Netherlands, from Colombia, from Mexico, and especially from Russia and the United States. They all signed that. They also signed those papers and giving all the guarantees and promising that nobody would, every party would be able to have its own representative without any limitations. And finally, the only thing that lasted was the date of the election. I mean, the Maduro government has trumped over all the agreements that were maybe during in those Barbados. But the important thing about the Barbados is not the Barbados agreements. I think the real agreements were not even in Barbados. Someone said the Qatar agreements are because on the 18th of October, the Treasury Department of the United States issued 4 licenses, allowing for 6 months to releasing Venezuela from some of the sanctions in the sales of oil, natural gas, and gold, and eliminating all kinds of prohibitions against secondary commercialization. Now, the government of the U.S. has not done anything about that, but I think that Maduro knows that he's hanging on that very, very. I mean that the possibility that he will that the sanctions will be reinstated is every time more a threat for the Maduro government. Now, I think that Maduro is wrong if he thinks that this can last for a short time. It's very clear that the first time, at the beginning, he tried to do what Chavez did in 2007, play around and say, okay, maybe this is different, we should negotiate, accept negotiations. Maduro accepted negotiations already in another election around 2013. But actually, he knows that this is not going to last because he lost by too many votes. He lost by too many votes. And the number of countries in Latin America rejecting what he's doing is very high. Nobody has said that he's going to support Maduro, nobody. That he's going to accept the government of Maduro. The countries are divided only among those that are willing to recognize today Mr. Gonzalez, and the ones that are still willing to wait for Maduro to deliver the results. And the economic problem is poignant in Venezuela, and it could be a big difficulty. Anyway, I would say that that this is certainly, as I said in a piece of an article yesterday, that this, however, reveals very strongly what's going on in Latin America, the weakness of our international system. All that Venezuela has. I mean, Venezuela destroyed the UNASUR. Venezuela is not a member of the OAS anymore, and can only count on the goodwill of China and Russia as members of the Security Council of the United Nations. And with only that, he can avoid any kind of international action that will find a political solution to this crisis. To say that what Lula said, while patience lasts, is certainly realistic. But at the same time, it's a tragic diagnosis of a continent that's still linked by an Inter-American Democratic Charter. Everybody signed the Inter-American Democratic Charter, and it has no weight, no solid institutions, and no way of agreeing. Now, I think that in the next, therefore, I think that we have to begin looking for. I mean, this is a situation that can prolong itself for too long, because the interests are very strong, and the possibilities of failure are not acceptable. So I think that we have to I think that new ideas have to be searched for. We have to look for new possibilities, new ideas. Probably the most interesting ones that have been issued lately was one that seemed everybody denied that was going on, with promising Maduro some kind of a way out, a personal way out, if we were willing to release power. He denied that, and the U.S. denied that also. But then also there's this possibility which has been invented from the view of one of our main Lula's counselors, which is twice former Minister of Foreign Relations Celso Amorim, who has suggested a new election. Certainly, the possibility of everybody. I mean, when you try to give solutions for these things, everybody says no, because we won, and that's it. We're not going to do it. We're not going to accept it. But I think that we have to find the way out, and probably I think that the idea of Amorim's proposal, as I read it this morning, is not only a new election; it's a new election monitored by the European Union. It's not just any new election in which they can do all the same things that they did in the first one again. this will be an institution, an international monitored solution. And it's a possible way out. It is a possible way out. We have to look for ways. I mean, things in the world are going on too fast. And when everybody was concerned about Ukraine, then came Gaza, and everybody forgot about Ukraine. And we don't want people to forget about Venezuela and Maduro to stay in power. And we don't want to have a new Guaido, in which Gonzalez will be the new Guaido, who is the president, but he doesn't run the country. People need to have some government to run a country, and Maduro is still betting on that. Now, the only way to cut that is create a solution with all the countries and with all the weight that the countries have. Maduro, as I said, Maduro opened the path several months ago for some kind of a solution for his economic problems in exchange for political concessions. Let's go back onto that. Let's have a new election. I think that would be the only way that's open today. And I think that deserves being discussed at least. The possibility of having a new election run by an international organization seriously, with all kind of procedures set in advance, and with the promise of Mr. Maduro that he will leave as soon as the vote is not in favor of it. I don't think that there's nothing to lose in that. I would say that in my country, of course, was the first one to say that we would not admit non-verified results. Everybody followed that. Since then, we have been in a position between what Mexico, Brazil, especially Brazil and Colombia, are trying to do. Mexico is basically accompanying this, and the position of the countries that have already recognized Mr. Gonzalez. We feel that we are not going to recognize any new government in Venezuela until the situation is solved. But we need to find a way out. And I myself feel that, and that's why I laid here as a possibility. That's why I think that the idea of a new electoral event would be probably the most reasonable solution at this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Insulza. Thank you for your remarks, and especially on this possible ways out of the current crisis, and Brazil's proposition of a new election that just came out. Ambassador Celso Amorim mentioned this yesterday, and something that it's all over the news here in Brazil. So with that, just would like to remind everyone, please send we're already receiving questions over here, so please send your questions to our participants. And I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. Kalout. Hussein, thank you very much for being here. You have the floor.
Thank you, Feliciano, and good morning to everyone. So let me start with that. Of course, my colleagues, they have made very clear their position and their assessment about the complex problem that Venezuela has in this moment, and about the current situation and the illegality that has been taken by the current government, current regime, frauding the electoral process. So everybody here agrees that the electoral process was fraudulent, and the electoral process lack of transparency and whatever minimum standard of international transparency. So that, to me, seems a consensus. So now I would like to focus on what about the Brazilian position and what the challenges are in the weeks or months ahead. First of all, what we have here at the stake, it's the Brazilian credibility and the president's reputation. Because since the beginning, Brazil decided, since last year, since the assumption of this administration to power, Brazil's foreign policy was driven by a sense of duty that Brazil must give or restore Maduro's legitimacy and prestige in South America in the attempt that Maduro will moderate its regime, and that will lead to at least an electoral process with not fair, but with less, I would say, leaning to a major fraud. Well, today, what I can underline clearly that Brazil's assessment and strategy to deal with Maduro's regime was strong since the beginning. So Maduro never ever had the intention to leave power, and never ever had the intention to let a fair and transparent election to happen in Venezuela. And why that? So there are several reasons that we have to tackle in this discussion. Never ever Maduro gave any demonstration that he wants to deal with the opposition for real. The electoral process start to be subject to a fraud, not now, it's way back months before the electoral process, when he started to close political parties, when he tried to arrest political adversaries vocal against the regime, when he started to impede candidate to register in the electoral process to compete with him, when he tried to annulate the right of voter overseas because he knew it that he will lose the election, So the fraud was in the making in front of the eyes of everyone. And here Brazil, in my opinion, and especially Celso Amorim, either they were convinced by Maduro that the process will be fair, and that was naive by all means, or alternatively, they wanted Maduro to remain in power. There's no other explanation for that. But they couldn't assume that publicly because they see the Venezuelan electoral process not a electoral process based on the willing of the Venezuelan people or democracy or human right or whatsoever, but basically as a component of a worldwide geopolitical clash between the world order led by US and the Western powers and by the new challengers that mean Russia, China, Russia, and the global South. And okay, so that said, well, in their assessment and their mentality, in their logical framework, choosing between a democracy leaning to the Western political order or to stick with a dictatorship leaning to what we believe is the new order, so it's better to stick with that. The matter of fact that Brazil could have had taken a harsh position on Venezuela beforehand. That is the point. And Venezuela, it is a tipping point to the success or the failure of Brazil's foreign policy and Brazil's current administration. And why I'm saying that? Because if we declare ourselves as the natural leader or the leader of South America or Latin America in per se, so that is the crucial issue where we should make all endeavor to solve it. And what is the solution? There's no solution. So peaceful transfer of power require wider negotiation, require concession. So what the concessions that Maduro is leaning to do it? It's not clear. He controls all the institution. So if we look, for example, to the Venezuelan Electoral Council, I mean, who gonna believe in the credibility of that council or in the Supreme Court of Venezuela? So nobody believed that the result of the decision will be adverse or in contrary of the regime interests, right? So nothing will compel Maduro to make concession. That is the point. Except, well, a total regional isolation, which also won't be the solution. So, in my perception, Brazil's reputation is at stake, and especially the president's reputation. And the president has been driven, and here is very important to emphasize, by his advisors that the regime were capable to win the election. He were convinced on that. And they misjudged the capability and the potential of the articulation of the opposition. And if you want to mediate, you have to talk with both sides. Until the moment, what it's clear that the current government is only talking with one side, or with someone in the opposition, which is not the winner side or the so-called winner side, right? So what will be the solution? Making a new election? I mean, this is an absurd, a complete absurd. By making a new election, by suggesting that this idea is explicitly recognizing that Maduro lost the election and the process was totally fraudulent. And why the opposition should accept a new election if they allegate they won? Because if they allegate that they accept a new election, so then they will contradict their argument that they won the election. And second, who's gonna make the election? The same institution that the regime controls? I mean, or the regime will accept an independent, transparent board of observers that they're gonna make the election accountable. So the solution, I mean, it's very delicate. And today, with this suggestion of a new election, or, oh, it's hypothetical, what else somebody said, it's hypothetical, it's an embryonic suggestion, is, my friend, this is absolutely surreal for a professional diplomat to suggest that. By all means. And that showed that Brazil doesn't have any strategy. And actually, with this suggestion, Brazil is trying to find a way to clean up its mess rather to find a solution to the Venezuelan problem concretely. Right? So, and yesterday, by seeing the position of Obrador clearly, right? That shows that the coalition that has been organized between Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil, it started to be this. It starts to be dismembered, right? Because each one has its own interest, and each one is going in one different direction. So this coalition that Brazil wants to lead with other left-wing government in Latin America to find a solution to Maduro or to the regime or to Venezuela or wherever, whatsoever, it is in process of dismember. That is the point. So, I can't find any solution that Maduro, that regime, in my opinion, they will move to a peaceful transfer of power, except if you have a massive social collapse, manifestations for months ahead, weeks and months ahead, and that will create a huge pressure over the institution and the security apparatus, which they have to say to Maduro, it's time to go to the exile. I have read once in a book, I'm not going to mention it, which I can't remember right now, that dictators only leave power in two ways, either killed or either they flee overseas. There's no way. They don't make elections to lose elections. They don't organize elections to make peaceful transfer of power. So here we are. And to stop here, I think we require a more serious strategy. And beside that, a more responsible decision-making and foreign policy vis-a-vis South America, if we want to effectively lead something in the region.
Thank you, Hussein. Thank you for your remarks, for your analysis of the Brazil's position on the crisis. We have received many questions and a lot of questions about Brazil's proposition of a new election in Venezuela, something that both Mr. Insulza and you mentioned. So I would like to, I'll put together a couple of the questions here, and I will start with this. Like, first, I would like to ask Ms. Tobar on her opinion about a new election coming up, with her experience of knowledge about the electoral process. What is her opinion on that? That will be the first one. Then to Ambassador Thomas Shannon, you mentioned in your presentation, if I got it right, the Brazil and Colombia position at the OAS and other countries that did not support the proposition to condemn the regime was important to empower these countries to give for them to have some room of maneuver to talk to Maduro. I think I got this. I think more or less that's what you said. I'd like you to elaborate on that, because the idea that we had here in Brazil is that Brazil was protecting the regime, not only Brazil and Colombia, but protecting the regime, not allowing the resolution, the OAS, to be passed. So that was the idea. But maybe there's a clash of opinions on that. So Mr. Insulza, you mentioned a little bit of the sanctions. I think this question also can be if Ambassador Thomas can elaborate on that, on the U.S. sanctions to the regime. The sanctions, of course, is a very powerful instrument that the American government has against the regime. The sanctions were eased during a period of time, and then they were restated more recently. And I'd like you to both elaborate on that. Do you think the sanctions can be an instrument to force the regime to a peaceful solution, or if the sanctions doesn't work anymore, it's already expired in terms of its political capability to change the regime? If Mr. Insulza and Mr. Shannon could comment on that as well. And I'll continue to gather questions here. So please, Ms. Tobar, start with you, then I'll pass to Ambassador Shannon, and then to Mr. Insulza. And then I'll ask a question for you, Hussein, at the end. I'm putting together here.
Just a note on the last name, is Rios, is my first last name, is Rios Tobar. This is a very problematic issue that I think we need to separate the sort of practical, realpolitik possibilities of dialogue from, the normative, the standards. And the first institutional position that IDEA has is that we really think that we continue to need to require that the results of this election that Venezuelan citizens trusted and took place and mobilized an entire country be finalized in some way. I think a process of dialogue should, as all of the international community has requested, including the United Nations, the European Union, and the OAS, every country in the region, to ask the Venezuelan state and authorities to accept an impartial evaluation of the results. I think that is very fundamental to assure electoral integrity and to respect processes moving forward. However, if a negotiation, a real negotiation that includes the opposition and that has the support of the opposition, and the opposition is willing with the government to undertake a new process that provides guarantees and where the international community is involved and the conditions for a new process would meet all international standards and would be agreed upon by all parties, I think, of course, that is something that has to be evaluated. But from our perspective, we really continue to see that it's necessary to commit the trust that citizens have put in this process, that the process is respected. I think it's a really complicated, unfavorable message that we sent throughout the region. If a government decides if they lost an election, they're just going to annul the election and do another election. So it has to have, for that to happen, we really need to have, met these prior conditions, and that an impartial process of evaluation of what happened on July 20th is conducted according to international standards.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree. Ambassador Shannon, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Feliciano. In regard to the OAS, the question about the OAS, quite frankly, I was surprised when the United States, along with Argentina, Ecuador, and Paraguay, presented a resolution in the Permanent Council and sought to win a vote that would would show support for the resolution. Because as Jose Miguel noted, Venezuela does not participate within the OAS, and it would have ignored any resolution coming out of the Permanent Council and considered it inappropriate. But also, the OAS over time has reflected the fracturing and polarization. And it didn't strike me as the right platform from which to engage Venezuela. Certainly not with the relationship that exists between President Maduro and Secretary General Luis Almagro. But the United States went ahead with this anyway, and I think showed in the process, when it could not collect a majority of countries to support the resolution, that it was unable to create a space for the OAS, and that Brazil and Colombia, by abstaining, and Mexico by not participating, were making a tactical decision, which was how to ensure and maintain some influence over the Maduro government. And that's why I think they took that decision. I don't have access to the inner reaches of any of those three governments. So if there were any voices arguing that it was necessary to protect Venezuela, I'm unaware of that. But at least diplomatically, I think this was a tactical decision that was taken in order to ensure that these three countries could engage and be received. in Venezuela. So that's point number one. In regard to the sanctions, Venezuela has survived the maximum pressure campaign. The government of President Maduro has survived at great cost, both economically and politically, but also in terms of Venezuelan society. But I think if our experience with sanctions reveals anything, it's that sanctions, especially broad sanctions that are designed to cripple economies, don't bring down governments. And the sooner we understand that, the better it will be for everybody. Targeted sanctions make sense in terms of identifying who's responsible for bad behavior, whether it be in anti-democratic behavior, and poor compliance with human rights regulations and norms, corruption, all that. That all makes sense. And also very targeted sanctions around certain technologies that have large national security impacts. Those also can make sense. But the belief that we can generate enough pain within a society and economy that the people themselves will turn on their leaders, that has never been proven. In fact, it's been disproven time and time again. And so I would argue that although certainly the Biden administration will probably end up turning to some kinds of sanctions, they're going to be very carefully crafted, and they're going to not to harm the larger strategic and geopolitical interests of the United States.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I pass to Mr. Insulza, please. You're muted. Still muted.
Okay, yeah, I'm muted. Yeah, that's
Go
fine.
ahead. Yeah.
Well,
go ahead.
actually, the first thing I would say has to do with the elections. Actually, I think the election is over. I mean, the opposition won the election. There's nobody in the world that's going to contest that. I mean, those is the opinion of the United Nations, it's the opinion of the European Union, it's the opinion of the OAS, it's the opinion, everybody's opinion, all the international observers. Mr. Diosdado Cabello said that fortunately they had this very decent organization called the Carter Center that was going to observe the elections, and the Carter Center said it was a fraud. So I mean, so nobody discusses the election anymore. I mean, that's so we have to find a solution, some way out. Now, a few years ago, Venezuela seemed to have a way out when they won the elections when they won the opposition won the elections and instituted Mr. Guaido as the person in charge that could take charge of the country. But the country continued to be running by Maduro. And I mean, they appointed, I mean, the OAS made a completely silly decision, from my point of view, of accepting Guaido's government as a representative of Venezuela in the OAS. And Guaido couldn't give an order to the policeman in the corner of his house. That's a fact. This is a political matter. And therefore, we need some political solution. And from my point of view, a political solution would be to say, okay, we give you a way out. You're going to be, I mean, this is having a disaster for you, or giving you a way out. The way out is another election. Of course, Maduro is not going to say, I love you, another, but he would have to, I mean, it would be difficult for him to accept it because now he's in power. He has power. He controls what happens in this country every day. He rules the police. He rules the traffic. He rules the social services. He rules the hospitals and the schools and everything. He's running the country. As long as he's running the country, he's going to stay there, unless you say you find a way out for him. So I am saying, let's find a way out for Maduro. About sanctions, I was referring to them only as a fact because this election was traded on sanctions. It was discovered. This was it wasn't the 7 or 8 countries signing the papers and all the opposition parties. It's saying, look, you let me sell my oil, and I'll have clean elections. It was Maduro who put those things on the table, not anybody else. So that actually, I think that that's a problem that he has. I mean, he didn't fulfill his part of the bargain. The bargain was that they was going to let him sell his oil, his gas, and his gold, and in return he would have a clean election. He did not have a clean election. He stole the election. Therefore, he's certainly vulnerable to being sanctioned. I'm not saying that I'm in favor of sanctions, of course. I've been against that all my life, just stating a fact, not defending the validity of the sanctions.
Thank you, Mr. Insulza. Now on a question to Hussein Kalout on Brazil's position on the. We have discussed this before, Hussein, on the that we both believe that Brazil is changing its position according to the circumstances. So that is something that is unfortunately happening in our interpretation, at least in my interpretation. That first we requested the tallies to be open up, the electoral tallies to be open up, and then since that was impossible, now we changed to a new election, and anytime soon. We don't know exactly what it is. So I'd like you to elaborate on that. I mean, because one of the things that Ambassador Shannon mentioned is that there are differences, important differences between Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico. The fact that Mexico is already stepping out of the coalition shows that they could not find a common agreement. Right? And it also shows something that you mentioned in an article recently, that if this coalition was recently created just after the election, if these three countries wanted to have some sort of influence in the process, they should have done this coalition before the election, right? In order to have more leverage over the process, not after the election. So I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that, on this changing strategies of Brazil during the process, and also in these differences within the coalition or between Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico, how different perspectives they have. Just a final remark, it seems to me, and I may be completely wrong, is that Mexico's position is very different from Colombia and Brazil. Mexico tries more or less to protect the regime, right? While Brazil and Colombia are somewhere between protection and change or free elections, right? So I'd like you to elaborate on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Feliciano, for your very good question. I don't want to be ironic, but I'm quite a little bit on fire today in the morning. Let me frame it in that way. When you talk about principle of strategy and how to build a strategy, and you know the concept, what strategy means. And when you look to exactly what you pointed out, the strategy, Brazil's strategy start to evolve in every momentum after every episode. And I mean, that shows volatility on Brazil's position. Brazil's position is very volatile, right? That means because either you don't have a strategy at all, you never had a strategy at all, or your strategy was very weak. And your strategy actually not only was weak, but was based on a bunch of wishful thinking that you believe that you could have control over the situation. And at the end, you discovered that you don't have that that control. And that why that could explain in somehow the frequent modification of Brazil's position during that process. Brazil's strategy in the beginning was to give Maduro legitimacy to interfere. But the matter of fact, Brazil never realized that Maduro doesn't need Brazil. That is concretely. As far as he gets the recognition of China and Russia, why he needs? He relies on Chinese money. He relies on Russian weapons. and he relies on Cuba's security of apparatus and intelligence. So being very frank and sincere, what aspect compelled him to rely on Brazil? And that is the point. And Amorim and his crowd, they realize right now that they thought that they have strategy, but they don't have a strategy actually. And their strategy right now, in my opinion, it is basically it's basically to find a solution for their own inconsistencies and incoherence, more than to find a solution to Venezuela. That's what it seems to the public opinion. Because nobody in the public sees that there is strategy. Because they're back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And we have seen this in Ukraine, the same thing they are repeating. In Gaza, the same things. Why? Because we lack of strategy. And that is the point, or a consistent strategy. So the idea that we could be influentials in any chessboard and we have the latitude to act in every key issues, that has to be symmetric with your resource of power. And that is the point. I will stay here.
Thank you, Hussein. It is in Brazil 12:23. Have 5 minutes. I'd like to give the floor to each one of our presenters for your last remarks on this very important issue for Latin America, the situation in Venezuela, a country that is so dear to all of us. I will start with Ms. Marcela Rios. Please, you have the floor. Then I'll pass to Ambassador Thomas, Shannon, then to Mr. Insulza.
Feliciano, thank you very much for the invitation. I think the Venezuelan crisis has once again put on the table the necessity to strengthen our regional governance institutions, the incapacity of the OAS, or the unwillingness of the actors to have that organizations have a bigger role is something that we need to solve. For whatever reasons we have reached this point, but it is something that needs to be assumed as a priority going forth in order to support democracy and help solve these types of crises. I think that it is essential that we continue to work to confront the crisis, and that we don't have the situation that everything continues as is, and that we have a perpetuation of a crisis and a de facto government for years to come without finding a solution for that to be able to prosper. Of course, we need dialogue and a capacity to intermediation. I think that independently of the difficulties, the only more concrete option that the region has at this point is the role that Brazil, particularly, and maybe Colombia and Mexico can help play with the support of other governments as well. So we, from IDEA, we are committed to continue to support and continue helping keep the situation of Venezuela relevant for the region and in each of our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. Now, Ambassador Shannon, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. And this has been a fantastic discussion, and I'm very grateful and honored to have been on this panel with such an illustrious group. I would agree with what Marcela has just said. This is an opportunity to take a close look at the institutions and structures that promote democracy in our hemisphere. and try to understand how they can work better, and how they can address the kinds of political crises that we are seeing in Venezuela. Because quite frankly, if the Maduro government is successful, this will spread, and it will be understood as a model for how to keep oneself in power. The United States has also experienced this challenge and could experience it again. So focusing on the institutionality of the region and the way in which our hemispheric and sub-regional groups function is important. But I would also underscore a point I made in my presentation, that in Venezuela, we have a new protagonist, and that is the Venezuelan people. And the mediators and the hemisphere, as they engage in this, have to, I think, show respect for what happened in this election, and have to show an understanding for how the Venezuelan people spoke, but then also have to find ways, independent of what happens in the negotiations between the government and the opposition, give some degree of hope and let them know that they're not lost, and that their country is not going to be abandoned, even with the kind of political leadership it has at this point. As I mentioned before, I do believe the mediators are operating in good faith, but this is a complicated moment. And should they fail, while it might not burnish their reputations as great diplomats, the ultimate responsibility will lie with the government of Nicolas Maduro.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. Mr. Insulza, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. I very much agree with what has been said up to now. In conclusion, I think that it has been a test. It's being a test for democracy in Latin America, especially in South America. We may have governments we like, we don't like, etc., but all our governments are democratically elected, and I think that we have learned to value that, and to value the fact of that democracy is something that we should try to keep at all costs. I do hope that this can help Latin Americans to get together and review, as Tom said, the kind of organizations we have and why they are so weak and changing every time. That's a fact. Now, I would like to just finish saying I'm very happy to have Brazil in charge of the situation now, working on this. Actually, I'm always worried about when I read things about the BRICS and other things and all that. I'm worried that Brazil will not continue its leadership in the hemisphere, which is very much needed. And so I'm very happy that Brazil is even in spite of the changes that Hussein was mentioning about, I mean, changing positions and all that. But the fact that Brazil is leading the search for a solution for me is very reassuring, frankly. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation and your participation. Hussein, we close with you. You're muted.
I will be very brief. It was an honor to be in the panel with Marcela Rios, Tom Shannon, and Jose Miguel Insulza. So the first observation that I can do, it is sanctions won't help to solve the Venezuelan problem, right? And in this, another observation, it is we should not repeat the same mistake of Guaido. So that it's clear, no sanction, non-new Guaido. That won't help at all in any negotiation process. Then I will go to the acknowledgement. The acknowledgement it is what we have seen. Brazil has certain constraints, right, to deal with the topic. If you don't have enforcement to compel the regime to negotiate, they won't negotiate. And then you need to have a wider international and regional support for that. But Brazil must, in this case, make clear what it is strategy and what its position. Chile has a clear strategy since the beginning, and even under a left-wing government, like it or not, right? So otherwise, if the current administration in the country, they decided to not understand that they have certain constraints to deal with Venezuela, every effort will be useless to solve the problem. And three, to conclude, and that a mix on observation and acknowledgement, it is, we cannot turn back and step away from the political process, right? So Brazil must establish channels and keep speaking with the regime, but also it's important to start to talk directly with the opposition, because that will be a strong sign to the regime. Because till now, at least publicly, Brazil decided to talk only with the regime, avoiding the victorious side of the opposition, or the so-called victorious side of the opposition, with the, with the romantic idea that will keep Brazil vivid and influential in the game. I don't think that will work. I think the regime only will take you in seriousness when you decide to speak with the other side. And they will realize that there's no friend anymore are capable to defend a fraudulent election and behavior, because that has backlash and that is damaging the reputation of the government. And that will have a domestic implication to Brazil and to the current government in Brazil. And that is the point. And I will stay here. Thank you.
Thank you, Hussein, and thank you everyone for being here. Ms. Marcela Rios, Mr. Thomas Shannon, and Mr. Hussein Insulza. It's a pleasure to have you here at CEBRI in our webinars. You will be invited to other seminars in the future. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our audience. We have around 100 people between here and our YouTube channel. This presentation is recorded. It's going to be there on YouTube for others to see. Please share the presentation in your social media. And see you soon. So bye-bye. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you
very much.
Bye-bye.
Welcome.
Thank you
Bye.
for the
Bye.
invitation.
Bye, Marcela. Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Gracias.
Ciao a
Bye.
todos.